Welcome, friends. Welcome on the barricades. On today's edition, we have a special guest, Arto Artinian, who's an associate professor at the City University of New York. He's a Bulgarian academic, and he teaches there. He's a member of the union there, and we had the pleasure of meeting him while discussing ways to approach the working class in our barricade event. He also is a member of the editorial collective of the journal Situations, published by the Institute of Radical Imagination in New York. I very much like the name of Radical Imagination, and the scientific secretary for the international collaboration at the Institute for Critical Theories of Supermodernity in Sofia, Bulgaria. Welcome to our show, Arto.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And as usual, we have Boyan Stanislavski with us, who is going to put questions about today's main topics, that is union and socialism. Unions and socialism. We invited Arto, as I already told you, because he's a member of a union, but not in Bulgaria, but in the United States. And he also teaches courses about critical theory at the City University of New York. So I'm going to throw in the first question. Please tell us more about this union that you are a member of, its activity, and how did you ended up being a union member, and about your struggles in general.
Okay, well, I finished college in the United States, and then I liked it, so I stayed in college, and eventually I got the graduate degree and started teaching, and that's how I spend I split my year in Bulgaria and the U.S., but my job is in the U.S. U.S. university, and I'm a member of the City University of New York. Is sort of the third largest university in the United States, about 700,000 students in the city of New York. And it has a union of the academic workers, whether it's professors, teachers, and staff. And it's called the Professional PSC, Professional Organization of the University of New York teachers. And once you join the university, you kind of automatically become a member of the union, because there's a rule which was won through labor struggle 40, 50 years ago that says that anybody who becomes a teacher or a faculty member of the university has to have their union dues taken from their paycheck as soon as they start getting paid. And that way it makes union membership kind of automatic. So that's how you become a member of the union. And of course, once I became a union member, I did my best, and I do my best to be involved in it as well as a rank and file kind of ordinary member. I'm not a person in power or leadership or anything like that.
Okay, so tell us more. If Boyan wants to put the next question so that we alternate, I don't want to take much of his time. Please, Boyan.
It's all right. Well, I want to ask about the general experience of being of having this everyday life in political terms and in private terms and in whatever other terms, split between Eastern Europe and America. I mean, I'm very interested in how does it feel exactly. And particularly from the point of view of this alleged superiority of the West. Okay, I mean there is this concept that's very popular throughout Eastern Europe, not only in Bulgaria, like particularly in Poland, where I'm based at the moment. This is a very strong, I would say, a traditional kind of idea, and particularly what struck me during the meeting that Maria mentioned in the very beginning of our conversation here, where the three of us met during the online event with Ben Burgess that the Barricade organized. And you said something that was, for me, particularly striking in a good way, because it kind of pulled the political emotional string that I carry in me when you contradicted one of our participants in the event who asked the question whether the Eastern European left can actually learn anything from the American one, you know, the kind of movement built around Bernie Sanders in 2016 and now. And then you said, look, but probably there are some things which, I mean, there probably is some space for inter-exchange of experience and stuff like that. But how about we actually analyze it from another point of view? How about the American left learns something from the Bulgarian one? And you know, this is very appealing to me, to people like me who actually think that, you know, we as Eastern European countries, as Eastern European movements, as Eastern European whatever political activists, journalists, and so on and so forth, we actually also have something to offer to the world. You know, we don't have to be the serfs all the time, and they and then being the masters, right? So I wanted to ask you, you know, if there's any, you know, general experience that you could share with us and with other viewers. Plus, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how do you perceive exactly the difference between the American, whatever, Anglo-Saxon model of the left and our Eastern European experience. That would be, I think, you know, very valuable reflection if you could share it with us.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions that often bother me as well. And so if I forget to answer some important part of what you mentioned, please remind me. But first of all, yes, we have to learn from each other, of course. But in my view, if I can kind of summarize it, in my view, I often joke with my colleagues and friends in America when they ask me, where do you come from? You know, because by the time you say Bulgaria, then you have to explain where Bulgaria is, and sort of, you know, the Americans are not very good in sort of geography or knowledge of the world, because they are this kind of, you know, superpower that's in the middle of the ocean, and a continent floating in the middle of the ocean, far away from the rest of the world, except its northern and southern neighbors, so they don't really know. But I often joke, I say I come from the future. I have seen glimpses of the future, you know, and which sounds ridiculous. But just to give you a brief 20-second summary, when I first went to America at the university there, I had very, you know, I mean, first of all, we Eastern Europeans, we are colonized people. I mean, we are essentially, Eastern Europe functions the way Mexico functions in the United States, to the United States. That's the way Eastern Europe functions to Western Europe and the United States. We're totally colonized, deindustrialized, wealth extracted part of Europe through a subservient, as they used to say in the 60s and 70s, I guess, in the post-colonial literature, comprador ruling class. So we are totally colonized part of the world, very little different, except wealthier than other colonized parts of the world, Latin America, Mexico, parts of Asia, and so Africa, and so on and so forth, the continent. So when I first went to America, I had this naive idea that that's the future, and we can learn from the American political struggles and kind of improve our own society. And that lasted a little bit, and then I was in shock. I was in shock by noticing little things about America. And I lived in New York City always, most of the time, for my studies and work. I noticed little things that were very shocking. For example, and this might sound funny, but if you walk around New York City outside of Manhattan, you see above the streets, you see power lines, like in villages in Bulgaria or Romania, you know? The infrastructure is so primitive in a certain sense, right? The gas lines in the houses are from 1920, and the power outlets are so kind of, and I said, wait a minute, what's happening here? And through these kinds of everyday artifacts and a few other things, I came to realize that the American left, and by the way, by the American left, I'm referring to, and when I say the left, I basically think about the left, not a little bit narrowly, the left that has decided that that capitalism and parliamentary democracy have to go away, because they're not good enough for people to reach and actualize their full potential as human beings and live a life devoid of violent, excessive repression. So when I say the left, I don't mean, in my mind, kind of the mild social democratic left that Sanders is referred to, right? So to me, Sanders, and we can talk more about this later, are simply liberal reformists who are trying to introduce elements of socialist, kind of mild socialist thinking in order to make America, the barbarity of American capitalism, then the way it treats the vast majority of its population a little bit less barbaric, right? But I realized that the American left is actually, compared to the Bulgarian or the Eastern European left in general, very weak. It has hardly accomplished anything, historically speaking. It has fought major battles in its own terms, a few general strikes, serious efforts against the Vietnam War, serious efforts against overcoming racial segregation, which were led by the Communist Party of the United States for a big part of the 20th century, and its kind of and the people that it influenced. Women's liberation movement had a wing, American kind of radical feminism had a wing that was explicitly leftist and is explicitly leftist. And of course, the latest struggle, the LGBT movement since the 60s, which has a kind of a hard left, clearly left. So of course, the American left is here, and it's doing extremely important work, but they're struggling in very difficult terrain, and that's why they're so weak. They're struggling in a society which, for a variety of reasons, it is so much more difficult to be a leftist, like an anarchist socialist or some kind of a communist, or whatever you want to call it, than it is to be such a person in other parts of the world, including in Eastern Europe. And that might sound weird because there was never an outright fascism in the United States like there was in Romania or Bulgaria, like a monarchical fascist regime, or in Germany or in Italy or in Hungary. But America had something much more oppressive, in a sense, and much more powerful. It had a totalitarian liberal regime, if we use Antonio Gramsci's language, which exercises to this day complete hegemony over cultural life and the life of ideas. So to be a leftist in America is very hard, because you're struggling against very, very powerful forces, but there are also kind of internal American kind of reasons for the left's self-defeating kind of ideologies, which today, if I could summarize, are expressed in this never-ending protest movement, how you want to call it, protesting movements. You know, that's sort of like the structure. And there's a big aversion to creating organizations that are disciplined, which imply there's some kind of hierarchies which can actually resist the liberal state and its servants. So I think, as an introduction, I would say the American left has, to me personally, almost nothing of value to teach in terms of the struggles in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, if you look at the 20th century itself, we've been through so many struggles from the left in Eastern Europe, especially Bulgaria, but I'm also Romania. I know a little bit about it, and I know about Hungary. I know less about Poland. In Bulgaria, just think about it. There was already in the early, right after World War I, there was already a prime minister, a government that had a majority in parliament, which was a left government. I mean, it was a government of essentially peasant. It was the peasant party in power, even though it didn't last very long and the prime minister was brutally murdered. Then there was a coup. Then there was an abortive revolutionary uprising, which was waged with force confronting the state, which was defeated, right? So then there was the anti-fascist resistance. I mean, you have a long history, and then the Bulgarian Socialist Party is one of the oldest organized Marxist parties in the world. So there's nothing that the American left can offer in terms of a historical lesson, except maybe what not to do. You know,
I mean, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. But I told you we discussed for a few minutes before the show, and I told Arto that, well, in terms of class struggle and the history of the socialist parties here in Eastern Europe, the West may have nothing to offer us. In terms of, let's call it, cultural or sexual revolution, they may have something to offer, because I gave the following example. Here in Romania, in 1968, just the moment they started to rebel against corporations in the United States and to rebel against state order in Paris and other places, Here in Romania, we introduced a law banning homosexuality, and we started putting the LGBT people in prison. And what is even more troubling is that that law survived. The infamous Article 200, it was called, survived even the revolution of 1989, and it was banned after the year 2000. So that is quite troubling. And as I told many times on this show, in 1966 we introduced the banning on abortion, and it was not like it is in Poland right now. If you think that it is bad in Poland, you should have seen what it was like in Romania, because it was actually state violence against women, because they had all the state apparatus, focused on controlling women's sexuality. So, maybe there was a way to see it, that patriarchy survived, unfortunately, the changes that occur in the public sphere. And as I talked to Arto, and as I told him, and I want him to elaborate, maybe because it is so much difficult to change the private, and maybe easier to change the public life of a society.
No, you're absolutely right, Maria, that Bulgaria too, it had, patriarchy was alive and well. But I think maybe we can think about it this way. Yes, in other words, when and if our politics, broadly defined, ever gets into a position of being able to shape the trajectory of our societies again, we should not make those mistakes, and we should not repeat those policies, and we should acknowledge them that they were wrong. But it's interesting. It's so the first thing that I want to say in this sense is that, in 1918, the Soviet government, Soviet Russia at that point, decriminalized gay people. It was the first state in the world to do that in modern times. Since the French Revolution, since as Michel Foucault has shown, since Victorian England and so on and so forth, where sexuality changed and being gay became something that was negative and so on and so forth. Soviet Russia became the revolutionary government of 1918, decriminalized gay people, and decriminalized, not decriminalized, but it dropped the requirement for marriage to be a religious contract. Mm-hmm. The first place in the world, or at least in Europe, let's say. So in other words, that's what happens when you have the ideals of egalitarianism and freedom driving state legislation. Of course, that was reversed in Romania, in the example that you mentioned, by the government that claimed to be in the same tradition as, right? Or in the Soviet Union itself, being gay was used as, it could have been used for reasons of political persecution, after World War II, we know, and so on and so forth. So it's complicated. There's, on one hand, you have this kind of trailblazing breakthrough where, for the first time in modern European politics, it didn't matter if you were gay or not. You were not a criminal. You did not do something and that was on the level of the state, right? At the same time, 30, 40 years later, that is reversed by the state. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us, and I'm going to quote here, like I said, shared with Maria, there was this very important Soviet philosopher, Ilyenkov, who died in '79, who is experiencing a little bit of a renaissance. In fact, there's a Facebook group by some comrades in England who are great in popularizing and reading and thinking about Ilyenkov. It's called International Friends of Ilyenkovs, that I recommend everybody check out if you're interested in this kind of excavation of Soviet philosophy that was not dogmatic, and it's an international group. Anyway, so Ilyenkov said in one of his letters, he said, we're not surprised when we see elements of repression in our own society. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. We understand where they come from. They come from the inertia and the habits of the society that we're trying to leave behind. So that's not an excuse. That's a self-criticism to say that if the Romanian state or the Bulgarian state or any state that was not capitalist passes a legislation that is incredibly oppressive for reasons that are impossible to justify, they should have stopped and thought about this and saying, what are we doing? What is motivating these actions? Is it my sort of inherent thinking about gay people that I'm carrying from my childhood, or from my own sort of ideological indoctrination growing up? What is happening here? So this kind of self-criticism should be organic for people who are leftists, right? And I think in that sense, I agree with Maria that should be something that must be clearly marked and not repeated, in the future. Yeah. So.
Well, before going further, I will let Boyan ask the question, and then I will thank Alex Sauchuk for making some comments here, and I will read it out loud, and then we should all discuss about what he said here. Because there are people watching, even though the program is not showing. I looked on Facebook and I saw that we have people watching online right now. So please, Boyan.
That's right. Well, thanks for this really valuable elaboration. I think. I mean, it's really well said in my opinion, and also, retrospectively, so to say, looking, at these political arrangements that we've had in Eastern Europe, before 1989, we should also acknowledge that things were different in different countries, and particularly when it comes to Romania, and Maria, of course, you and the Romanian women, you get my sympathy because of the terrible experience, of the ban of abortion and so on and so forth. But I also want to make sure that we don't extrapolate it to the entire region of Eastern Europe, because while there was severe and absolutely horrendous repression against women in Romania, then I really think that the Romanian regime, hideous as it was, and the Albanian one was quite different from many other, as I say, political arrangements in Eastern Europe, and I think this is my observation. I mean, I haven't really done any research, but that's my general impression from the literature I've read and from the discussions that I've had with people who are analyzing or are analyzing these. This period, in different countries in Eastern Europe, I'm talking about 1945, 1989, then, the kind of conservatism, or what we could refer to as a corpus of conservative ideas, was much more embedded particularly in Romania and Albania, than in other countries, which, despite perhaps the backwardness of some leaders, despite the backwardness, or I'm not sure if backwardness is really the correct word, but just for lack of any other at the moment, of society and so on and so forth, they were at least, struggling to kind of use the emancipatory language, and there are some results of these attempts. And for example, the position of women, because you said in Poland at the moment the situation is not as bad as it used to be in Romania before 1989. I'm totally. Yeah, I totally believe you, of course. But also what I want us to acknowledge is that before 1989, the position of women in Poland was better, than it is now. And of course, if you ask the representatives of the liberal feminist movement, they're going to tell you no, because it was horrendous, it was dictatorship, and it was patriarchy, and you were not even able to, speak or about, I don't know, you were not able to take up the kind of anti-patriarchal discourse, to use the modern word, in before 1989. Now I'm not so sure about whether you were not able to do that, but what I want to say is that abortion was free, legal, and available to everyone, and same was contraception, and so on and so forth. So that definitely gave women a lot. That was a major liberating thing, and also, the byproduct, so to say, of the industrialization of the society, of the urbanization of the society, that also lifted up, the position of women to and again, as I say, I mean, you can have all kinds of reservations against what's been happening then, but from this particular point of view, it's to me undisputable in a way that the position of women was increasing all the time, with general growth. Now, the question of the public and the private, which I think is very important, and the left in at least in Poland, I mean, I don't know about other Eastern European countries, is pretty much obsessed with this, like, you know, the private and public, everything's political, everything is the same, everything has to be discussed all the time, whatever you do at home and whatever you do, you know, on the street or in the pub or in square or anywhere in the public sphere, it's the same, and so on and so forth. And while I think, you know, it's this interpretation that prevails here is pretty much over the top, I kind of acknowledge that private can be political and private can be public and public can be private and so on and so forth. I understand this interconnection of things, but then this is how things work. Again, that's my observation. Okay, I'm not an academic. I don't have any research to support this observation, but obviously, you know, the general consciousness of the masses, so like to use the Marxist jargon, it's you know, it's not always in step with the changes that happen, okay, in terms of politics. And you know, sometimes the culture sort of is you know, develops progressive traits a little later than they occur in the law and stuff like that. And you know, there are multiple examples of that, not only in the past but even now. I mean, there are multiple examples of leaders, left-wing leaders, who have been, you know, displaying all kinds of very right-wing or conservative behavior in their private lives, and you know, that's been just, you know, leaked out to the public and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to say is that there is this contradiction between the massively kind of conservative, maybe or conservative habits of the general consciousness, and the political movement that drags things to the front. And I think that the question that Arto posed, like why did it actually happen? Okay, that for example, some government like the Romanian one or the Soviet one, they actually decided to take a step back. And I think there are many reasons, of course, for that. We're not going to be able to tackle them all, but the one that is, I think, very important to put forward here is that because they were losing legitimacy for all kinds of reasons, because of growing dictatorship, because of not managing, you know, dealing with many social problems. I mean, we're talking about post-war era, and that was really difficult. Okay, so because they were losing this legitimacy, and because they've lost the kind of organic connection that they've had with the people that was born during the times of the revolution or the revolutions in other countries around around the region, then I think they had to refer to something that was in the society deeply embedded through, you know, ages of, say, Christian dominance or, you know, patriarchal culture, whatever you want to refer to, right, of this conglomeration. So they did this, okay, and of course some of them gave it some progressive cover, some didn't, but even in Poland, okay, where, let's say, the abortion is free and legal, and today, for example, the church claims that it used to be repressed before 1989. The leaders, the first secretaries of the you know, Communist Party, was called the United Workers' Party of Poland, they participated in church rituals, celebrations, and not all of them, but some of them did. Okay, so it's not an easy thing, okay, to just, you know, cut it off and yeah. But I totally agree, totally 100% agree with Arto that when he says that we have to build socialism, but a better one. You know, we have to learn from the failures that occurred in the past.
I mean, there are so many good ideas. A couple of things just came up to me based on hearing Maria and Boyan's latest conversation. The first thing is, obviously, without maintaining the critical point to these kinds of absurd criminalizations of gay people, or restricting the rights of women over their own bodies and so on and so forth. On the other hand, something else I noticed teaching in the United States is that, comparing it to Bulgaria, for example, is that in Bulgaria, you see a lot of college professors who are women, like middle age and later, like women in their 60s. And so, in fact, if you go to an academic conference in Bulgaria, you will see a lot of women of that age, right? So in other words, you're not going to see nearly the same amount if you went to a similar conference in the United States. And the reason is, in the 1950s and 60s, for women, to go to college, to the university in mass numbers in the United States was simply not present. Right? This is before 1968 and so on and so forth. You went if you were very affluent, or here and there are exceptions. But so what does that mean? That means that in practical terms, one of the achievements of Eastern European politics or socialism, socialist governments, or however you want to think about it, was this incredibly fundamental shift in one part of society, which is the labor place, in some places, now I'm not saying everywhere, but in higher education or in education, there was a situation of egalitarianism in terms of access to universal higher education. To say nothing about primary education, right? Where women were much more present as teachers, right? Elementary school, capitalist societies had elementary school teachers who were mostly women, right? But in terms of higher education and the industrial late 20th century knowledge-intensive economies, which required more and more college-educated specialists, and thus the university playing a strategic role in the reproduction of society and capital in general, whether it's private or public, what Eastern European socialism accomplished was the full entry of women, not only into the workforce, but into the most strategically, arguably important part of the workforce, which is knowledge production and reproduction, the university. So you see a lot of publishers, editors of journals who are women in their 60s, 70s. You see a lot of senior professors who are famous in their fields who are women. And you just don't see that in the United States, or not nearly in corresponding numbers. Now, it's not a statistical thing. It's a real quantitative and qualitative difference. And it's a difference in terms of socialization, because little girls could grow up and nobody would tell them, or in general, they would not be told by society itself, your place is not in the university, your place is to get in the kitchen or to get a menial job in the factory only, because that's what women do. No, the opposite was true, right? So in other words, there are these multiple currents that kind of emancipatory politics accomplished, while at the same time having these contradictory movements to backwards with these restrictive and oppressive laws. So I think that's the challenge, right? To recognize the major achievements and to recognize the major errors and avoid those in a future political program. But nothing like that is even spoken about today. I mean, if you look at the American university, yes, there are liberal feminist moves of, it's all about numbers. Like we need to have 40% women, 40% men, these kinds of mathematical ways to find structural oppression, which shows that it's fake. It's fake because the numbers can always be manufactured.
Some sort of soup, and I call this the kitchen-like perspective on feminism, where women are some sort of spices, and you have a soup, like add women and mix. You have to put some women, put some gay people, put some people of color, and stir, and you will get the perfect soup. This is the.
I mean, think about it. The future American Minister of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, they're saying is going to be this black general. And that's seen by the capitalist media, by the New York Times, and by the opinion-making media. That is seen as a major progressive step in America's fight against race, a society that's based on slave owning, which treated black people as legally second-class citizens until 1964, period. Right? To say nothing about mass incarceration, that there's more, America has the highest imprisonment rate of any country in the world, adjusted per 100,000 citizens, right? And most of those people are people of color, and most of those people have done nothing criminal. They've been caught with marijuana in their pocket because they want to use it, or these kinds of things. Anyways, but the point here is that the media capitalist media would say, Biden administration, Of course, Trump is clear. It's just straight up kind of orthodox, racist, white supremacist. America has had a black president, yes, as Alex mentioned in the chat. America has a black vice president now, who's a woman. So, see, America is achieving all these things that, maybe even Soviet Union didn't achieve, right? But there are other questions here.
They had the first women in government. That was Alexandra Kollontai, and she was
exactly in the Soviet Ukraine Republic of she was elected
1917.
Right,
like,
but the contemporary Ukrainian fascists who predominate in the government don't even recognize her as this is why I refuse to recognize the contemporary Ukrainian government is nothing but a product of the Cold War, which anyways, but that's a different conversation. It's a bunch of fascists in a land where the fascists killed millions of people. It's one of the most horrific crimes against the people of the Ukraine since World War II, to have that kind of a political regime enshrining Nazi collaborationists who lost the war as heroes. That is one of the major reasons I think that society is falling apart, unfortunately. But anyways, that's a different conversation. But the future Black Secretary of Defense is on the board of Raytheon Corporation, which is one of the major weapons production capitalist corporations of the world. So first of all, you have a military general who's going to be the Secretary of Defense, which violates the wholly American division, right? Where the civilians have to control the military, right? So now you have a former general who's going to, because he's former. Secondly, he is a business executive of a major weapons manufacturing that is fueling global imperialism, but he's Black. So that is supposed to make it okay, right? So that's how primitive American politics is, or mainstream politics. And I see elements of that in Eastern European politics as well, Bulgarian politics as well. It's very primitive politics, right? But that could be a separate conversation. But I just want to say to Boyan's point that it seems to me that capitalism can accommodate anything. It can accommodate a gay president, any kind of an oppressed, marginalized group, whether it's a Black person or a gay person or a transgender person or a Native American person. We can have presidents or people in power of any of those oppressed groups, as long as you do not touch and mess with the control over the relations of production, the means of production, and state power itself. If that gay person who's the president, if that African-American who's president believes in capitalism and parliamentary democracy, then everything is fine. They will be welcomed to the club, as long as they follow orders within the ideological frameworks. So I think that's failure to see that, which happens all the time, creates automatic losses in political struggle, right? Because identity politics will always be accommodated by the capitalist class, as a class, right? Individual capitalists might be racist, or they might be misogynists, or, you know, Donald Trump is a misogynist and a racist. It doesn't matter, because as a capitalist, as a group that have a political program, they can accommodate anybody, as long as that person or those people are also sharing their ideological orientation. And I think, and maybe this is sort of the next point I wanted to make, is that, and I was reading this book by Badiou, a long interview, philosophy, and I think it's Philosophy and the Event. And I agree with his idea, because they ask him, so how can the left kind of reignite its powers again? Because we have to remember, in the 20th century, there were two ideologies, two ways of thinking about politics that were dominant, right? It was broadly revolutionary, leftist, egalitarian, emancipatory politics, or it was fascist politics. Those were the two ideologies that had the most energy, if you will. And they fought the big fight, right? Which the liberals won, because they stayed out of the fight long enough for the others to win the war for them, right? So American liberalism skillfully stayed out of the war until Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and then fascism was defeated at the cost of a destroyed Soviet economy and society. So anyways, so how do we break away out of liberal hegemony? And Badiou says something that I totally agree with. He says, we have to reject, first in ideas and then in actions, the consensus. What is the consensus? The consensus is, it's a formula, Badiou says, parliamentary democracy plus capitalist economy, capitalist economy. You have to reject both. Both of them are incompatible with human freedom, understood as an egalitarian society that allows and encourages the flourishing of everyone individually and collectively. The old Aristotelian ideal of the good life that motivates all progressive European philosophy since the Enlightenment. Kant's letter of toleration, right? And Kant's letter in the Enlightenment. What does Immanuel Kant say? He says, I want to live in a society where every human being who reaches age of maturity physically is also mature in terms of their thinking, their actions. We know how to think, we know how to act, and we act in ways that are unlike other animals that are not humans. In other words, life is more than having enough food and shelter and sex and reproducing and not being killed. The old liberal lesson of Hobbes and Locke, which is a very primitive ideology, right? Life is a war and you have to stay free and you have to have weapons to... No, that's not life. That's when humans have been reduced to bare life and we live in a state of emergency, which is not supposed to be normal, right? A normal life as a socialist, a communist society, a life of collaboration that's thoughtful. Yes, excesses happen in Aristotle's law of the mean. You know, this is ancient ideas that we're recycling. The law of the mean, the balanced life. Sometimes we have to engage in excessive behavior, but only when the situation justifiably demands it. And we have to know when that is, together and as individuals, right? So Badiou says you have to reject capitalist economy as a structure, as a thing. You have to say it doesn't work, it harms us more than it helps us. It's destructive to the world that we live in and to us as individuals and a society. We have to find something else. And you have to do the same thing with parliamentary democracy, because parliamentary democracy is the product of capitalist ideology, right? Liberalism is the political philosophy of the capitalist class. Literally. I mean, that's what John Locke was. That's what, and all of his successors, they found ways to justify the emergence of capitalist private property in England and to justify the stealing of the land of the commons and the formation of slave-owning economies in distant lands that had to be justified. How are you going to claim some other land is yours when God created all people, right? Well, you invent liberal philosophy. And of course, it had positive elements, individual freedom, and as we know from the French Revolution. And but Napoleon interpreted those rules, and the radical Jacobins interpreted those rules better than Locke. They created universal education, public education. They created universal healthcare system. You know, Napoleon did this, right? So well, we have to destroy liberalism is the prime enemy of the left, not fascism. Liberalism is, because they are the ones in power, and they use fascists. None of the people in Europe are genuine fascists, thankfully, right? They might use fascist rhetoric, or the guy in Hungary, Orban, or whatever. It's not a... He was a fighter against communism, right? He was repressed by the communist state in Hungary. Well, maybe there was a good reason for that. Now I'm starting to think. Maybe there was a good reason Viktor Orban was repressed by the Hungarian socialist government. Maybe they knew something about him and his politics that they found to be very dangerous, and they were right to do so. I mean, that makes you think, right?
Well, yeah, I would suggest here a great book about liberalism, because it is highly praised, and especially in academic circles, is Domenico Losurdo, The Counter History of Liberalism, a great book.
One of the greatest books, yeah.
Yeah, and it should be read and discussed maybe in a future edition and at our podcast. We should discuss it in somehow. I have several questions for you. I don't read it. I haven't read it yet. What? You haven't read? Oh,
no, I just said that give me some time to read it, like maybe in 2 or 3 weeks.
Well, it's great. It's great. It's been translated into Romanian. We can read it also in English, and I can give it to you.
It's the greatest attack on liberal philosophy.
I see now that we have some problems with the streaming online.
Well, okay.
It says here that we have to stand by.
Oh, okay. So, yeah.
Oh,
there was a problem, but I think it was resolved. Okay.
Yeah,
so I will use this break and make just a few points about what I heard from what I just heard from Arto. First, I want to thank you for this, because it's so rare. Okay, it's so rare these days to hear that kind of rational perspective on things. Okay. And for me, it's a real pleasure that we have this, that we're actually having this conversation, and I really hope we're going to be able to have more of it, particularly about liberalism and about how liberalism has been, for reasons which I find totally irrational, but again, I don't want to elaborate on this right now, has been somehow merged, okay, mentally, philosophically, if you like, with some left-wing or allegedly left-wing ideas. I think that's very important, and also that the problem of the liberal domination, liberal dominance is much more difficult to tackle and to act against politically than fascist elements in the society that we obviously have in Poland, that we obviously have in Romania, that we obviously have in Romania, France, wherever you look at it. But, you know, as long as they are just somewhere on the margins, okay? Like, for example, in Poland, there's this great hype. Oh, we've got fascists in the parliament, which, you know, fascists, Catholic fundamentalists and stuff like that. Okay, of course, it's not good that we have them in our parliament, but they are a group of 11 people there out of 460, and it's unlikely that they will get any more support than they've already gotten, because we live in this unprecedentedly grotesque period of complete implosion of liberal democracy and capital, economy. And these two things, they produce, okay, these kind of pathologies that you can experience sometimes, like the Polish, fascist whatever party that we have in the parliament right now. But the big problem is not that party, okay? The big problem is the government, okay, which is softer than that party. Yet it's, it's like it's governing, okay, the internal political process and the economic one as well. So, I want to say that the question of capitalist economy, definitely, that's one of these. Perhaps this is the most important element of this, what I call the neoliberal guardian in the left wing, heads, okay, of the left wing activists. That but we cannot really overthrow capitalism, and this is a very big problem, because I think that the left in general has departed from the idea that they're actually going to change the world. Okay, they've just given up on the notion of socialism and stuff like that, and they just, for the lack of anything better, they just started employing this what is largely referred to as identity politics, because you can be very radical, okay, about it, and you can create a lot of hype, and it will get you exactly nowhere. I mean, okay, it will get you the you mentioned the Secretary of Defense, okay, who's going to be probably a black person, or Kamala Harris, the prosecutor in chief, or it can get you the Barack Obama, the deporter in chief, the drone striker in chief, all kinds of stuff like that, right? And I think that this is a conversation that has to start. Okay, because it's not like we haven't had any ideas about socialist economy in the past. It's not like there aren't any ideas about it now. It's not like we don't have China, who has planned economy, okay, and it's been lifting millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the, last 20 years or something like that, okay? And again, this capitalist media that you mentioned, be it New York Times or anything like this, okay, its equivalents in Europe, they will go like, oh, capitalism is good. Well, they wouldn't literally say that, but that would be the bottom line. Capitalism is good because so many people were lifted out of poverty in the last 10 years. Well, okay, that's mainly due to China, that. So
they can't claim, right. No, this is a great point. And it just reminded me, we have to, with China, if we can just say 10 seconds, I don't know much about China. I know a little bit and I want to know more, but China is very interesting because there's a move. I have a very provocative kind of question. It's not a question, it's more like a provocation just to think about. I could ask somebody, what's more democratic? Two-party system or four-party parliamentary system where all parties are controlled by capitalists or have capitalist ideology in parliament?
The public doesn't trust them, okay?
Right?
And it's
versus one-party system, which has wide internal democracy and multiple factions, which is not controlled by capitalists.
Right.
What's more desirable for the average person? Yeah. Within the context that we live in a global capitalist world. So if you ask the question like that, the liberals will go crazy because they will say, aha, one party, no good. But actually, if you think about it, is China and the Chinese state, which of course is authoritarian, but when people say that Chinese authoritarian, any state is authoritarian. Any state is authoritarian by definition. Whether you want to use Weber's definition or you want to use common sense or Machiavelli, if you are in a position of power, and you meaning you are a representative of a social class or class alliance or political party or political parties, you are going to exercise coercive power over your political enemies. Otherwise, they will do that to you and you will be gone. That's like a basic human political 101. Politics is not a conversational activity where we debate everything and we shake hands and we leave.
Totally.
As we all know, it's about force that you believe is being
power,
used for the right purpose.
Power.
Yes.
And sorry, just before, because I wanted to make one more very important point, referring to what you said previously, okay, and I'm finishing. I know I was speaking probably for too long, but what I want to say is that you said that, you know, there's this liberal concept, okay, that was invented in order to justify the stealing of land and resources and colonization and so on and so forth. Totally, yes. But I also want to say that, you know, liberalism is constantly transforming itself and develops new kind of completely, when you look at it rationally, okay, in a rational society, that this would have been rejected, you know, without much, you know, much of questioning or anything like that. But liberalism constantly invents this sort of formulas that are, you know, playing, you know, with people's conception of life and perception of reality, of everyday life, and so on and so forth. And now the most popular one, and that's prevailing in Europe, liberalism offers that everything is a contract. Okay, everything is like, you can just, you know, you sit with some of your peers, and it's a contract, like whatever it is. It could be your job, it could be a date, okay, because there's a lot of, you know, consent now, and I think it's totally justifiable. Okay, I'm not mocking it. I'm just saying that this is part of this philosophy, that everything can be contracted, and once the contract is done, then no one has anything to do with it. Be it the state, the police, other people, your neighbors. It's a contract, okay? It's been contracted and so on. So liberalism is a terrible menace. I totally admit that. And, you know, I used to be, like in the past, I used to flirt, okay, with liberalism, liberal ideas and stuff like that. And I want to say that, you know, I kind of, I really came to the conclusion that it's almost on the verge of, you know, some kind of mental disorder. Like when you look at it, like to me, it's terrible.
I want to interject something here, that Michel Foucault has a wonderful analysis of the way this whole idea of liberty that animates us and of freedom was somehow hijacked, because peace is another form of war, he says, and I might add a war with words and with discourse. And it is so perverse, because everybody has this ideal of freedom. And the great peril here, I might add, is that the definition of freedom and liberty has been somehow hijacked to serve the elites. And while the people still believe in it, they do not realize they believe into a definition that serves only the elites. And that would be the final remark. We'll let Arto answer and make him promise that he will come back to our show.
Yes. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I kind of feel like we should continue the conversation at some point in the future, because so many ideas, like I just took an outline for myself based on what you were saying. And so maybe I can just share a few of the bullet points that I like you made me think about, which I feel like we should talk more about. But in terms of capitalist contracts, yeah, slavery depended on contracts, literally. And most of the law, I have a colleague and a friend at City University of New York. She's Puerto Rican, and her research is in 15th century mining around the world, sort of at the 15th, 16th century mining at the cusp of globalization, you know, Columbus's trip and sort of the Western European expansion into the colonies and other continents, and slavery's introduction of slavery, modern slavery, right? Racial slavery, right? Because remember, slavery in the ancient world was not racial. There was no concept of race. That's a English concept, right? That's a Protestant. I mean, I'm not sure it's a Protestant but that's an English concept first used against the Irish, right? The colonization of Ireland, and then they moved it. And I mean, the Spanish had, anyways, but. And she was searching, she studies mining laws and slavery and so on and so forth. Slavery strengthened the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition. A lot of cases, what to do with my property, with this property, very valuable property. So when somebody's really supportive of contracts to do things in life fairly or whatever, you should ask them the question, like, so do you support slavery? Because that's the prime vehicle for which contracts were invented in the English-speaking world that we all speak now. Right, because we all live in every country in Eastern Europe has basically some shadow of the American Constitution in there. There's some kind of a language from the American slave owners' constitution, it was written by slave owners. I think the 90% of them were slave owners. Anyways, but the bullet, so in addition to that, I had this idea. So yes, we have to relentlessly attack liberal ideology as deeply wrong and harmful, obsolete, the ideology of a time that's been already proven wrong in the 20th century, even though it emerged victorious. But the right side doesn't, the good side doesn't always win, right? So their victory doesn't mean that they had the better arguments. But also, so how do we attack liberal ideology? Well, we have to gather our former heroes and our present heroes, so to speak. Like, for example, Pasolini. There was a recent art show dedicated to Pasolini's life in Plovdiv, in my hometown in Bulgaria, by a German curator and Bulgarian curators in an ancient Ottoman bath. It's very beautiful. And it made me remember Pasolini's work, and I am reading one of his novels again, and he absolutely despised the bourgeoisie that was liberal or fascists. And he expresses that in his movies and in his writings and his poetry and his articles. Was widely read. So in other words, where are these people? In other words, we have to reestablish historical continuity with our past. The past that's worth saving, right? Which is a lot of it. In my case in Bulgaria, me and my friends, we're doing in our own way, trying to reestablish historical continuity, right? With our socialist past or communist or anarchist past. So we have to do that in addition to, like Maria said, waging like this discourses in the media, like your publication is doing constantly in multiple languages, and also we also have to write about these new ideas and think about these new ideas. For example, Badu says this, and I agree with him on this too. He says, how do you destroy the compromise, the consensus, parliamentary democracy plus a capitalist economy? And he said, well, first of all, you have to dethrone the fundamental political value of liberalism, which is liberty, freedom. Freedom must be protected above all costs, says all liberal societies, right? Like ours. And everything derives from the protection of individual freedom. But what's the problem with that? Individual freedom is the gateway that legitimizes and permits capitalist private property as the freedom to do whatever you want in your own factory, or to organize Amazon.com the way you want to, because you're free to do that because it's your company. And then you use people to work in Amazon who are passing out because they're working in horrible conditions. But you can do that because it's your job. It's your free choice to establish a business any way you see fit. And if it's successful, then that's all the reason it needs to exist. So we need to dethrone the value of freedom defined as individual choices as our highest value. No, that shouldn't be the highest value. The highest value should be, one way to think about it, should be, we want to live in a free society as free people, which can only happen on the precondition that it's an egalitarian society. And we can debate what that means, but egalitarianism has to be the ground from which freedom, that kind of freedom emerges, not the freedom of contracts, which is basically the freedom to use stuff, like to eat a pizza, or to use an apartment, or to use a human for your own private gain. That's an old, obsolete kind of a barbaric idea, because it leads directly to, for example, COVID-19 being a terrible disaster in the so-called advanced economies of the European Union and the United States, but not in China, the most advanced economy in the world today. I'm not saying that there's no oppression there and exploitation, of course, but the trajectory, the Chinese planning is vastly superior. Their state capacity is much more democratic and humane in COVID-19 than the American or the European. Less people died, the economy is less disrupted. The people have a sense that the state, the healthcare system are kind of doing their best to deal with it. There are no large-scale riots. There's no stupid mysticism about aliens or conspiracies that the virus is not real, that they're going to put chips in us, that so many people in Europe and America believe in. Unbelievable. In China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, I have read there's no out-of-control pandemic. How come in those societies they're dealing, and that's freedom. That's freedom, to be free of a contagious disease that is adequately controlled by our collective efforts. That's the highest definition of freedom. And whereas we live in absolutely we live in prisons. We can't go outside. We can't shake hands because we're going to get the virus, because we're treating the pandemic stupidly for a variety of reasons directly connected to the political ideologies and the economic system. You know, in America, I came back here for a few months, and I have to get tested. In Bulgaria, to their credit, the testing took 5 minutes. It was in a parking lot. They sit in a booth. So you reach out in front of the booth, a hand comes out and they swabs your nose. 5 minutes. I come here in New York City, 8 months after the pandemic started. I go to a private testing facility, 5-hour line. There are people waiting outside in the cold. They said 5 hours. And then you go inside and there are 30 people inside sitting next to each other. That's New York City, COVID, pandemic. Why? Because there's no state capacity that can actually handle this rationally and appropriately. That's oppressive state. That is the complete lack of freedom, right? When it comes to your health. Now, I have freedom to buy my house or to sell a house, or if I have the money, or to quit my job, right? But I don't have the freedom to get tested in ways that are not going to infect me with the virus, right? So this is a very barbaric ideology that COVID is showing its complete bankruptcy. It's not a good way to organize society at all.
Thank you so much. On that note, very inspiring definition and perspectives on freedom. Thank you very much for
Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to future visiting your studio and listening to other people you have and being kind of involved with what you're doing. Yeah.
Right. Thanks so much. And
thank
all
you.
the best wishes to our viewers and to you. Stay healthy. And well, see you next year.
See you next year.